Today we're breaking down 5 players for the 2025 fantasy football season that I want no part of whatsoever. These are 5 players that I am absolutely avoiding in all of my 2025 fantasy football drafts. All right, let's kick the video off with Brock Bowers of the Raiders. This is a player that I know might cause a little bit of a stir here, but I am just not a fantasy football drafter who selects tight ends in the early rounds of fantasy football drafts. I never have been. I don't think I ever will be. And right now we're seeing Brock Bowers going at an ADP of 14.1 on the Sleeper app. That is putting him at a premium price of an early second round selection. And I am just not willing to pay that price. Now, I do believe that Brock Bowers is not going to be a bust in 2025. I do believe that he will more than likely, barring any injury, finish as a top 5 fantasy football tight end when all things are said and done. So I understand that you are getting a great positional advantage when you select Brock Bowers. But once again, I think when you look at strategy, you can still draft a very good value tight end later in your draft, a lot of the times much later in your drafts, and still put together a fantasy football team that can win a championship without spending an early draft price on the tight end position. I think that you can easily get a lot more better overall value for your fantasy football teams when selecting running backs and wide receivers in the second round. Let me look a little bit deeper here at Brock Bowers. Going into his sophomore season, I 110% believe that he is going to see some sort of regression because his rookie season was just so good. I mean, 153 targets, 112 receptions, over 1,100 receiving yards, just under 1,200 receiving yards, 5 receiving touchdowns, 15.5 fantasy points per game. I just don't think I see any scenario where these numbers don't regress somehow. I'm not saying it's going to be awful by any means whatsoever, but what I will point out to you guys, and you could say this is a stark comparison, is that, Sam Laporta, after his rookie season, was the tight end 2 off of boards going into last year's fantasy drafts after finishing as the tight end 3 in fantasy points per game in his rookie season, as well as finishing as the tight end 1 in full PPR in his rookie season. And what did we see last year with Sam Laporta? He had regression, finishing as the tight end 8 overall in PPR, as well as the tight end 8 in fantasy points per game. Played 17 games in his rookie season, played 16 games in 2024 for what it's worth, but ultimately, I do believe, even though that was a very solid year at the tight end position, that we could see similar type of regression for Brock Bowers in his sophomore season. I don't know if it'll be as drastic as a drop from the tight end 1 to the tight end 8, but I do believe that he will fall back in overall rankings because regression is just due here. Then we look a little bit at what this offense is going to be in 2025. It'll be very different than what we got in 2024. Last year, we had this kind of mix between the noodle arm Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell at the quarterback position. No real run game. All of the targets were there for Brock Bowers and Jacoby Myers at the wide receiver position. There's nobody else on this team that was consistently involved. Now we look to 2025. It's a different system under head coach Pete Carroll, a solid quarterback in Geno Smith, who we'll talk about a little bit in a second here. And then we're going to see more of the run game evolve in this offense too, with rookie Ashton Jeanty at the running back position, which will take away some of the volume in the passing game. So ultimately here, I just think that regression once again is due for Brock Bowers. And then we look at Geno Smith. Look over his career in terms of targets to the tight end. I will put it up on the screen right here for you guys. It is very, very low overall, and I just don't know if he is going to be looking to Brock Bowers first and foremost all the time. Once again, Brock Bowers is going to be heavily involved in this offense. I do believe that, but I just think we're going to see a little bit more involvement from Jacoby Myers, maybe some of the rookie receivers on this team like Donta Thornton, Jack Bech, and we're going to see more of the run game implemented in 2025. So for me, I'm just out at his given ADP. I'm staying away every year from drafting a tight end in the second round, but especially right now, this is way too premium of a price for me to be paying selecting Brock Bowers in the second round as we approach 2025 fantasy football. Let's talk about DK Metcalf of the Pittsburgh Steelers joining a new team in this offseason. Going to be a little bit of a different look for a veteran wide receiver in Metcalf, who's coming off of a season where he missed some time last year. It looked like he had a little bit of a missed step overall, finishing as the wide receiver 34 in fantasy football. You guys see these stats on the screen. Was the wide receiver 30 in fantasy points per game, and ultimately had a decline in targets, receiving yards, touchdowns, and fantasy points per game overall last season. Although we should mention he played in 15 games compared to 16 in 2023 and 17 in 2022. To be fair. But ultimately, when you break down his stats, well, 2023, we saw a little bit of an increase in production. He has been on the decline statistically over the past 3 seasons. And overall, last year is a little bit of a tough year, finishing as number 54 amongst all wide receivers in route win rate. And I just don't know if that's going to translate the best in terms of his new quarterback, Aaron Rodgers, who we will talk about a little bit more in a second here. But we look at both of these offenses last year, both the Steelers and the Jets last year. The Steelers in 2024 were 23rd in total offense, had just over 3,600 passing yards, which is 212 passing yards per game under this Arthur Smith system, 21 total passing touchdowns. Out of all the teams that ranked between number 14 and 25 in total offense in 2024, the Steelers had the most rushing yards with over 2,100 rushing yards. All the other teams there a little bit higher in passing yards. This is a run-first offense, and even with the addition of veteran Aaron Rodgers, I don't think that's going to change in 2025, which I don't think is a great thing for DK Metcalf. And even if we were to look at the Jets offense last year, guess what? They were one spot behind the Pittsburgh Steelers with just over 4,000 passing yards, 236 passing yards per game, 31 passing touchdowns, coming in 24th in total offense last season. So even when we look at what Rodgers did last year, even with a lot of targets to Devontae Adams in the second half of the season, a good overall chemistry, I guess you could say, for Garrett Wilson. He had the most productive season of his career yet. We're not really getting a drastic difference between the Jets and Steelers passing attacks last year. And I think ultimately all signs are indicating that we could see a dip in production due, once again, to the offensive coordinator here, everybody's fantasy nightmare, Arthur Smith. Then we look a little bit deeper at the Steelers offense last year. You think about George Pickens, right? He was 15th amongst all wide receivers in red zone targets last year, 16 total red zone targets. So even like we're looking at that alpha wide receiver 1 type for this Steelers offense, they didn't really get Pickens that involved when it came to trying to score touchdowns. Now, kind of elephant in the room here is that we didn't have the best quarterback play last year out of the Steelers. But once again, it really felt like, A, when Justin Fields was the starter, they kept him in a box, didn't let him play to his strengths. And then B, it just kind of felt like almost the same with Russell Wilson, although they let Russ cook a little bit more than Fields for sure. But then it just always felt like there's kind of like this pressure holding back this offense. And I just don't know if this Arthur Smith system is going to benefit DK Metcalf at the end of the day. Now, once again, we kind of mentioned Garrett Wilson coming off of his best statistical season yet. Listen, there is an argument here. You look at what Garrett Wilson did last year. You look at how force-fed Devontae Adams was once he was traded to the Jets. There's certainly an argument here that Aaron Rodgers is going to go out and just absolutely force-feed the alpha wide receiver 1 in this offense, which on paper is still DK Metcalf. So I understand that argument at an ADP of 49 overall, kind of going about mid-4th round. Maybe that kind of risk is worth it because I do think we could see the scenario where we come out of this where Metcalf had a very heavily, aggressively targeted season in 2025, and that could benefit him. But I think ultimately there's too much writing on the walls here that just concerns me. So when I'm in that range, looking at wide receivers on the board, I am avoiding DK Metcalf for 2025 fantasy football. The wide receiver that I've been avoiding at all costs in all of my fantasy drafts is Jaylen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. And listen, I will admit I've just been burnt one too many times by Jaylen Waddle. If you guys have followed this channel for the existence of this channel, I was an early Jaylen Waddle truther, and that has not really stopped over the past 4 seasons. I always find a way to give Jaylen Waddle a chance, and this year, heading into 2025, I'm just not doing it. You look over the past 3 seasons for Jaylen Waddle, he has declined in targets, in receptions, in receiving yards, in yards per catch, in receiving touchdowns, and total games played. I mean, overall, the decline in every statistical category that we don't want to see a decline in, we've seen Waddle fall back in. I mean, it's worth noting, I suppose, 2022, he played in 17 games total, then 2023, 14 games, 2024, 15 games. So some of that is baked into missing 2 games last year and 3 games in the previous season. But that is another thing that concerns me, is that we always have kind of Jaylen Waddle hanging around on the injury report, right? Hear this strong argument for a lot of Miami Dolphins offensive players about being tied to the health of Tua Tagovailoa, right? And we look back since 2023, Tua Tagovailoa has been on the injury report 6 times for the Miami Dolphins. Concussions involved there, so I understand that this argument may not be one that everyone agrees with, right? But we look at Jaylen Waddle since 2023. He has been on the injury report 13 times, over double the amount of times as Tua Tagovailoa, which, don't get me wrong, like running backs, receivers generally will have more injuries pop up, but he is an injury-prone player. And if you're going to point the finger at Tua and like kind of be a stay away from this offense due to the health concerns, quote unquote, for Tua Tagovailoa, then there's no way you can look at Waddle and not say the same. Once again, has been on the injury report 13 times since 2023. And that's one of the problems here. Waddle feels like one of those players, like even when he is listed as healthy and active, you don't always trust him to get that full production for you. Over the past 3 seasons, once again, his fantasy points per game have lowered from number 12 to number 21 to number 50 last season. That is a drastic drop off. And ultimately, once again, with Jaylen Waddle and like being tied to Tua, a lot of the games where Jaylen Waddle did not produce last year, Tua was perfectly fine and healthy and on the field. Waddle had that little stretch, weeks 12 through week 14 last year, where he was productive, 11.3 or more fantasy points per game in those 3 games with a ceiling of 28.4 fantasy points. And then he got hurt again in week 15 and then missed the rest of the season, right? And you look at the games last year where Waddle was healthy, where Tua was healthy. I mean, let's just look here. Weeks 8, or we'll start in weeks 8, right? 8.5, 7.6, 8.6, 5.7. And the games before that were even more concerning. So if you are concerned about Tua not being able to play this year or getting injured, go back and look at some of these games for Waddle when Tua was hurt. They were just as bad. 8.5 points, 6.6, 7.6, 8.6 between weeks 2 and week 5 last year. Then week 7 after the bye week, 2.1 fantasy points. So too many single-digit fantasy points per game. It's amazing to me that he still finished with an average of 10 fantasy points per game last season. He had a good game week 1 against Jacksonville as well, but that secondary was absolutely awful last year. So there's once again just too much writing on the wall here. That concerns me. An ADP of 66.7, you're not spending extremely high draft capital on Waddle, but for me, when I'm coming around into the mid rounds of fantasy drafts right now, I can just not hit the draft selection on Jaylen Waddle. He is a must-avoid player for me as we approach 2025 fantasy football. Let's talk about Chris Lave of the New Orleans Saints. This is another player going in the later rounds of drafts, so I'll give him that. You know, there's a little bit less risk involved here as we start to progress through this video, but Chris Olave is a player that I was actually kind of high on initially going into 2025 that I've just found myself coming way off of as we get closer to the fantasy season. And I think the biggest concern for me here isn't necessarily Chris Olave, but it's more so there's a big question mark around what this offense is going to be in 2025 with a massive question mark at the quarterback position. We don't know what we're going to get out of Tyler Shuck, who was a quarterback who went a little bit later. terms of quarterbacks in this draft. I mean, still went in the second round overall, but not too bad, I suppose. But then after that, I mean, we've got Spencer Rattler, Jake Haener, the ghost of Taysom Hill. We just don't know what we're going to get at the quarterback position going into 2025. And then once again, we have Chris Olave coming off of an injury-plagued season where he dealt with some very serious concussion issues. And I try not to get too concerned about concussions, and I don't think that's really too baked in for me in terms of my wanting to avoid Chris Olave in 2025, but it is a concern at the same time, and I think even if it's not your highest concern, it's a concern for a lot of people out there, so it's worth mentioning. And once again, this is just a big question mark around this offense at the end of the day. Last year, they were 21st in total offense. They only averaged 219 passing yards per game, which comes out to just over 3,700 total passing yards per game. And over or almost 1,600 of those passing yards came after Derek Carr was injured, which would come down to 226 passing yards per game without Derek Carr last year. So if we can kind of look at those numbers and maybe anticipate that's what we'll get this season. Now there's been a change at head coach. Could be a very different offensive system this year with Kellen Moore as the head coach of the Saints. But once again, looking at the paper here, looking at the roster, 226 passing yards per game isn't going to ultimately lead to enough volume that is going to produce high caliber fantasy wide receivers. But the argument for a lot of people here is, once again, you're getting a later round player in Chris Olave, and he should garner all of the targets as the wide receiver one here. Rashid Shaheed is going to get some volume, also coming off of an injury-plagued season. Alvin Kamara at the running back position will still get some volume here as well, but Chris Olave will line up as the wide receiver one, and at the end of the day, there's always that argument, right? Bad offenses still produce good fantasy players, and bad quarterback play, I mean, they're going to have to hone in on that wide receiver one. So I understand all of that, and I can understand wanting to take some chances on Chris Olave, who was the wide receiver 25 in his rookie season, over 1,000 receiving yards. In his rookie season, wide receiver 16 in 2023, over 1,000 receiving yards, 4 more receiving touchdowns in each of those respective seasons. Last year, averaged 9.6 fantasy points per game, but once again, only played in 8 games last year total. And you can even argue it was essentially 7 games since he got hurt in week 9 with just 1 target and 1 catch for 13 receiving yards. But once again, this just feels like one of those offenses I'm trying to stay away from the most part when it comes to the passing attack, because I just don't know if the true volume is going to be there. Now, if Tyler Shuck steps in and is a productive quarterback in his rookie season, which some people definitely believe that he can be, then you're probably getting a good value here. But once again, I just don't know if there's a tremendous amount of upside in drafting Chris Olave. So for the most part, he's going to be an avoid player for me as we approach 2025 fantasy football. All right, one more wide receiver with a crappy quarterback situation is going to be Jerry Jeudy of the Cleveland Browns. And this is a player, once again, who I found myself pretty high on to start the beginning of this current offseason. And then I've just started to slowly come off of Jerry Jeudy as the offseason has progressed. Now, he has the best value in terms of ADP here, sitting at an ADP of 74.3 on the Sleeper app. And one thing we can look at when it comes to Jerry Jeudy is that he improved in just about every single metric last year, coming off of his most productive season and best fantasy season of his career by far. 145 targets, 90 catches, over 1,200 receiving yards, 13.6 yards per catch, 4 receiving touchdowns, 14.2 fantasy points per game, the wide receiver 21 in fantasy points per game, and the wide receiver 12 in full PPR last year, and had that really big stretch last year. Overall, right? We look at weeks 8 through week 17, he gave you double-digit fantasy points in each and every one of those games, except for week 16 against Cincinnati. Then you also look between the first 4 weeks of the season, he had 11.5 or more fantasy points in 3 out of those 4 games. Now we go into 2025, right? And we have a big question mark at the quarterback position. But what concerns me the most is that a lot of that production, right? We look between weeks 8 and week 17, like I said, well, it came when Jameis Winston was the starter for the Cleveland Browns, and we were getting that kind of air it out, screw it, Jerry Jeudy's down there somewhere, type of games on a week in, week out basis, interceptions, touchdowns, whatever it was going to be. It was famous Jameis, and the Browns were a lot of fun. Don't get me wrong. But this year we go into things with Joe Flacco, Dylan Gabriel, Kenny Pickett, Shadur Sanders, and the ghost of Deshaun Watson, and we just don't really know what we're going to get out of this Browns passing attack whatsoever. Obviously, Joe Flacco has been able to put together some games the past season or two that do result in production for wide receivers and fantasy. But then once again, we saw some pretty bad games from Joe Flacco as well last year. So it's just a big question mark here, and I don't know what to expect in terms of how that's going to impact Jerry Jeudy. Now, one thing you could look at here is Dorian Thompson-Robinson did get the start for the Browns in Week 17 last year against Miami, and Jeudy finished with 21.4 fantasy points in that game, was hyper-targeted with 18 targets, 12 catches, 94 receiving yards, and maybe we get some production similar to that, where once again, similar to what we talked about with Chris Lave, Jerry Jeudy's just hyper-targeted because there's not really anybody else on this offense who's going to be able to steal away a lot of receptions. Cedric Tillman, I do think, is a good deep sleeper, and I love David Njoku at the tight end position. Obviously, we got a big question mark about the running backs in this offense at the moment, but outside of that, I mean, we got like Deontay Johnson on this team, and I mean, that's really about it in terms of receiving options. So I just don't know what we're going to get out of this Browns offense going into 2025. So at the end of the day, when I'm in these later rounds, I'm willing to maybe take some risk on Jerry Jeudy because the production was definitely there last season, but it becomes a big question mark for me. And he's a player that I want to avoid for the most part because I just don't think ultimately that production will repeat itself in 2025. And that'll do it for today's video. There are 5 players that I'm avoiding as we approach the 2025 fantasy football season. If you guys are new to the channel, this is all we do here all year long. Free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. If you guys are into that, be sure to subscribe on the way out. And you guys can check out any of our other videos for the upcoming 2025 fantasy football season, which will pop up somewhere on the screen here on these 2 playlists. Check those out. Start to get yourself prepared for the upcoming 2025 fantasy football season. We're going to have everything that you guys could possibly need here on the channel. Most importantly, if you guys have any fantasy football questions whatsoever, make sure to drop them in the comment section down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.